VP. I'm one of the co-founders of Plato, and I'm super privileged and excited today to have Sam here. So for those who don't know him, Sam is one of the co-founders at Box. So Box provides a cloud content platform used by huge organizations like Walmart, GE, Eli Lilly, and even the US Department of Justice. They currently have like more than 2,000 employees globally. And Sam has spent the last 12 years leading the technology vision at all layers of the technical stack. But Sam is also a Plato mentor on our platform, and he's been helping dozens of mentees since he joined a few months back. As you might know or may not know, each mentor, when they join the platform, have to tell us stories. So we go back in their experience and we ask them, we interview them, trying to understand like what's their experience in engineering management. It's a way for us to vet their background, understand their strengths, but also identify like what they like and what they want to mentor people on. So one of Sam's story that I particularly enjoy is all around feedback. So that's how we're gonna kick it off. So Sam, like, can you tell us a little bit more?
Yeah, I'll just give like a brief kind of overview of the story. So I started Box with 3 friends in a garage in Berkeley. And we initially hired our first like 10 to 15 engineers, and it was like really amazing culture, and everyone had like really strong personal relationships. And then as we grew, around 60 or 70 engineers, we made this very specific head of backend, VP of backend engineering hire. And him and I didn't really see eye to eye. It wasn't going super great. Technically, on almost any technical topic, we would always have like a lot of conflicts. So we went back and forth a bunch, and it turned out he was kind of like telling members of his team to kind of like disregard what I was saying in meetings and just kind of go with what they felt with. And it kind of got really kind of tricky, and eventually the head of engineering and I worked together, and we basically decided like it's probably not a good cultural fit, and we decided to let him go. The next day, I came into work, and I was pulled aside by the head of engineering, who him and I were running basically the department together. And I was pulled aside, and he said, hey, look, a lot of people on his team are talking about like leaving. They're really upset about this. And in the back of my mind, I was like, okay, like that seems like a natural reaction if it's your manager. Like, we probably have to, go through and talk with the team and kind of go through what happened. And then I said, so yeah, it's about the firing, right? He's like, well, no, it's actually about you. And I was like, what? Excuse me? And he's like, no, like they're talking about they're really upset with you actually. And I'm like, what? Why are they upset with me? Like, what did I do? So I started meeting with them all the engineers on his team and a lot of the senior engineers more broadly in the org, and I started getting all this feedback as I started asking, like, what's going on? I heard like you're kind of upset with how things happened. What's going on? And I started getting all this feedback around like, well, you in a lot of technical discussions, engineers were telling me like you don't really listen, like you kind of have your favorite engineers that you listen to. You are very bullheaded. You're very like loud. You're very forceful with your opinions, and that results in not the best idea getting chosen. Just like you're kind of the loudest.
And how did you take that news? Like getting this almost in a couple of days from all of these people?
Yeah, it was horrible. It was really, really bad. It was like 5 days straight of just continuous feedback. Everybody telling me how bad of a job they thought I was doing. But what got me through it was I was genuinely curious. I was genuinely like, what is going on? Because the things people are telling me does not resonate with how I view how I behave. My perspective is like, I like to, and the culture that, this is like my first job, like this is my first real thing, and it's like taking off all that. But when we were first a few engineers, just 5 or 10 of us all in a room working day in, day out, we would be able to get in a room and just hash things out, right? Be able to argue vigorously and just always. And I would always say, all I care about is the best idea. Check your egos at the door. All we're doing, like very meritocratic, like all that kind of stuff, right? Like, how do we get to the best idea and leave everything else? And I didn't realize that as the company scales, that's not the best interaction mode, especially with engineers who may be more junior, who may have recently joined the company, who you don't have that personal relationship with. I just assumed everybody would just get in the meeting room and we'd be like, okay, we got to figure out the database design for this thing and be able to duke it out.
And how do you make it work? Because you end up like after this week where you laid off the VP of engineering, you get this 5 days straight of how horrible you are. So how did you make it through?
Yeah, well, first, so the first thing I did was I didn't know. I just was kind of aimless. And then what happened was our head of people at that time said, you're getting an executive coach. And I was like, what's that? And he's like, he's going to help you. I'm like, okay. So what the executive coach did was pretty amazing. He went around, he spent like 10 to 15 hours interviewing one-on-one, individually, each person that I worked with, both direct reports, all the way down the stack through to my peers and kind of the other co-founders and things like that. And he got pages and pages and pages of people, and it was very important he was like a third party because he could just tell people, look, like I have no dog in this fight. I'm here to help Sam get better. Like tell me what you think. And that was a really key piece. Was his like kind of unbiased perspective, and so people trusted him and really told him what they thought. Then he sat me down about a week later after that, and he said, okay, let's go through it, your strengths and your weaknesses. And the strengths were fine. It was like people think you're very smart, and they believe in you, and they trust you, and they think you're doing what's best for Box. And I was like, yeah, okay, fine. What's the bad part? And he's like, well, basically all this stuff that. So he's like, people think you play favorites. People think you don't really listen. The stuff I mentioned earlier, right? Like people think you don't, that you don't really vet ideas. You just kind of go with your gut or things like that. And things that, again, were completely opposed to the way I viewed myself. And so that was like also really, really challenging. So what happened after that is he helped me. We went through each thing one by one, and he was like, you realize people aren't saying you're bad at, what you do. They're saying you're bad at interacting with people. It's two completely different things, So he was like, let's work on that. So he walked me through, that in and of itself is a whole topic. But the really key thing is like, I was not getting that feedback.
And why do you think the people at that time were not? Because they had things to say apparently. They managed to say it to that executive coaching and coach. And why weren't they able to say it before to you?
It's a great question. And it's really the root of the issue. I mean, I think the thing was like, I didn't even know to ask for it. I assumed people would tell me. It's an assumption that if you've ever joined an organization and you've interacted with, the C-suite, right? Like the C-level people, like that makes more sense intuitively if you've had that experience. But for a lot of, first-time founders, they end up going along with this rocket ship of a company and they don't have that experience. They don't understand why someone who doesn't think you're doing the right thing wouldn't just tell you. Well, why wouldn't they tell you? Because there's a lot of risk with that, right? Like they may risk being perceived as someone who complains or is a bozo or doesn't want to play ball or all kinds of things, right? Especially if I'm not receptive, which it's not that I was never receptive to feedback. It's just I never gave an impression that I would be. So nobody even really wanted to try.
I see. Yeah, it's a pretty amazing story, and I guess it was like a turning point in your career, not only about getting better at those things, but like in approaching the way you interact with people from this point on. Like also for the audience, like what's the number one thing that you'd recommend people to avoid getting into that situation?
The number one thing is you need to really show people that you need to demonstrate over and over again that you are receptive to what other people think of you, even if it's negative. And a lot of people get into the situation where it's like, well, what if somebody tells me what they think and I disagree? Or there were reasons I did that, or they just don't understand. Well, if you don't get the feedback, if you don't get the opportunity to listen to them, hear them, make them feel heard, and then respond with your context, not with a defense, but with your context. If you don't even have that conversation, they'll never know that, and they'll never know even to give you the feedback in the first place. So that you have the opportunity to tell them what's really going on or what your perspective is.
But then you need to create that safe environment between you and the other person, so that they're not fearing of getting fired or
Totally.
not being favorite or stuff like that. How do you manage that, building up that relationship
Right.
over time?
Absolutely. So the first thing is, if someone ever, like, if you ask for feedback and you get some, even if as they're giving it to you, even if your gut reaction is like no, that's not right, that's wrong, that's fundamentally not what's going on, you have to pause, right? And you have to really acknowledge and appreciate that the person is going out on a limb to tell you what they truly think, and you have to thank them for that. And I mean, don't just say thank you, but you're wrong, right? That's not what I mean. You have to genuinely appreciate them, right? And thank them for the risk they're taking, right? And say that's my number one technique, especially with someone I don't have a deep personal relationship with. If they tell me something, even if I think they're just completely off base, I take a moment to be like, listen, I really appreciate this, and I want you to know I'm always receptive and available to hear what you have to say about my performance. And then, if you want to respond, you can, and it's usually good to engage, but respond with things really couched in, well, what I was going for, and I can see how it didn't, get perceived that way, but what I was going for was X, Y, or Z. Or the reason I acted that way is because from my perspective, I was trying to accomplish this. What do you think of that? Get into a really genuinely curious place where you're asking how do you think I could have done better in that situation? And then once they say that, you can be like, oh, that's a really interesting point. Here's why I think that is or isn't a good idea or whatever, right? But that would be the main thing.
So when you truly disagree, I guess the point here is to bring the other person, give the other person the context
Absolutely.
that made you take that decision or made
act
you
that
act that way.
Yeah, or whatever it was.
Exactly. Because sometimes there are other forces pushing you to do stuff, like at your position, potentially investors, other founders, and that led you doing things that you had to do, and it might have been hurt. So it's all about giving that context, I guess.
Yeah, it's let's say I cut off a technical conversation that I think is going on too long, right? And later someone else thinks some maybe a senior engineer or junior engineer, whoever, may believe, rightfully or not, that was a mistake, right? That's the kind of thing where I may have cut it off because I've had this conversation with 7 different teams already, and we need to actually move on and make a decision on this. But from that person's perspective, maybe this is the first time they've talked about it, and they just have a totally different perspective of the situation. So the way that gets resolved is through good conversation, right? Conversation where you're really listening to the other person.
When we talked earlier today and via email, you mentioned a super interesting story about someone in your legal team and how they build trust with the team. Can you elaborate a little bit?
Yeah, this is one of our top attorneys at our company. She's incredible. Her name's Sanam. She's phenomenal. And what she does with her team, she was telling me, and I thought this was incredible. So she frequently has calls, legal calls with other parties, right? Whether it's a negotiation or a contract or a case or whatever it is. And it'll usually be her and maybe one of her direct reports, right? And they'll be on a conference call together. They'll do the call together. And then, as soon as the call's over, they'll have a few extra minutes. So they'll sit in the room. And the first thing she does is review what she could have done better in the call, right with her direct report. And then after that, she says, what do you think? How do you think the call went, right? But with the first thing being her pointing out the things she could have done better as the manager, as a leader, what kind of environment and relationship do you think that creates with her direct reports, right? It says right off the bat, no, I'm not going to focus on criticizing you or mentoring you, all this stuff. Everyone has opportunities to improve, right? And it just sets the stage, right? So any opportunity you have to do that with your directs and be like, hey, look, that last meeting, I don't think I did a great job. What do you guys think? Totally changes the tone of the conversation versus, hey, what'd you think of that meeting I ran? It's oh, well, it's good, I guess. Okay, thanks for the feedback, bye. That's what a lot of people do when they ask for feedback, and it doesn't work,
So it's leading by example.
Yeah.
It's proactively
absolutely.
looking for feedback, forcing yourself, I guess, because sometimes you might not want to send that email or have that conversation after each call.
Yeah.
Forcing yourself creates that environment of trust. And then people would more likely give it to you and I guess, more likely receiving it. I guess that's kind of the
Absolutely,
whole
absolutely.
concept.
Yeah, and like, don't make it this big thing, right? It's like, oh, it's feedback time. Like, let's sit and really focus on feedback time. It's like, you can always like, let's like, I've had this so many times where it's like a meeting with like 7 people, and I notice one person's just a little bit. I'm sure you've seen this. Like, it's a little bit uncomfortable, or it's a little tense, right? And your temptation is just to be like, okay, it's fine, and like go to the next meeting, right? Especially if you're busy, if you got a lot of meetings and things. But if there's someone like, if that happens, instead of just kind of pushing it on the rug and ignoring it, just casually after the meeting, as you're walking down the hall, just pull them aside and say, hey, I thought that meeting didn't go as well as I would have thought. Like, what are your thoughts? Just leave it really open-ended and just let them like kind of express what's on their mind. That kind of just proactive cycle will help you not end up kind of in the situation I ended up at, where there's all of this built up energy because you've never allowed for it to release. Like, formal feedback sessions are great too, and you should have those for especially harder conversations. But
talking about one-on-ones and
one-on-ones, workshops.
Yeah.
There's a lot of consultants and things that'll come in and run sessions, workshops. I think those are amazing generally. Yeah.
But the informal piece.
But the informal stuff is it's easy to underestimate how powerful it is, for
All
sure.
Right. So let's try to get some actionable advice here for our audience and I guess for myself as well. Like and like becoming a leader also of this company. So how do you get better at this? I'll start with a very open question. Where do we start?
So I'm going to be totally honest. Besides an executive coach, which I highly recommend, it can be expensive, but to me, it's like, it's really common sense for us to think we need a coach for a sport or a teacher for a skill. But for some reason, when it comes to our professional lives, we don't even think about it. We're like, what the coach is a weird, awkward offshoot thing that maybe I'll get to someday, right? But no, there are a lot of people out there, and like I recommend asking around. You might be surprised who does have a coach and who is using one. But I highly recommend getting one because they will be able to really adapt the advice and feedback for you specifically. The second big thing that fundamentally changed my perspective was reading the book Crucial Conversations. I think that book is incredible. I think what they basically do is they go through scenario after scenario, conversation after conversation, and most of them you've probably seen in your life, personal and professional, like examples of an executive in the room who is too abrasive, right? Or a conversation at home about who's taking out the garbage. Like conversations where it gets kind of like very tense and emotional very quickly, and how to deal with that, right? Techniques and tools to disarm the emotion and bring it back to sharing context. So that book, Crucial Conversations, I think is an incredible, underrated toolbox for getting better at this kind of thing.
Yeah. So you talking about that book, there's a fundamental concept, right, behind the book. It's about silence versus violence.
Right.
Could you elaborate a little bit, like, what do they mean by silence? What is the violence?
Sure.
And I guess the whole point of the book is finding that middle ground between silence and violence. Can you elaborate a little bit?
Yeah, and I see this over and over. I mean, as a co-founder, you get a lot of people coming to you with issues, just almost on like especially people you have like personal relationships with. And what I saw over and over again with interpersonal conflict is you get into this mode where you can either confront the person, and it's a very high risk, operation where you're pretty sure that they're not going to be receptive, or you just go along your business and you do nothing. And you just accept what they're doing, right? An example could be like if your manager is giving you goals, right, that are always way too aggressive and don't really understand the business. And you keep getting these goals, and you're just like, no, this doesn't make sense. And you try and express it, but the manager's like, this is what we got to do. This is what we got to accomplish. And it builds up and it builds up, and then it's like, well, either I have to confront my manager and basically tell them all this stuff about they don't understand the business, they don't understand my job, they don't understand what's going on, and have it erupt into this huge thing that they're probably not going to be receptive to, or I just keep doing my job. And most people find themselves in a place where like they don't know how to escape from that like duality. So that's what a lot of the book does, is it talks you through, okay, there's this middle path of actually resolving the situation that is a skill that you develop over time, And like, when you first hear this stuff, it is really hard, and you will probably mess up a lot, especially if you haven't done it a lot. Like, it is a skill. I remember just initially people would say like I was trying to be more inquisitive versus just an advocate from my perspective. I'd be more inquisitive. And so people would be like, hey, I think we should do it this way. And I'd be like, why do you think we should do it that wrong way? It's like okay, like cool question, that's not really the point. The point is to actually be inquisitive, and it takes time to practice like being able to check your own assumptions and perspective and actually genuinely look at things from the other person's perspective is something that takes practice.
Mm-hmm. I see. And I think also when dealing with engineers, sometimes engineers are introverts or they hardly, are going to express, and feedback is something they're trained on. And how do you deal with that difficulty of being able to get information from engineers sometimes? Do you have any tips or ways for you to kind of extract information sometimes and get the feedback?
I mean, you need trust, right? That's so important. If the person doesn't trust you, nothing else will work. Even if it's in their best interest to do something, it's not going to work. And the ways to build trust, it's like another book that I like is Radical Candor. It's this focus on, if the person doesn't believe that you care about them, they're not going to be very incentivized to participate in tough discussions with you because they've already dismissed you. So you really have to find ways building that personal relationship, being genuinely curious about what's going on in that person's life is a great way to do it.
And create that trust, and so it's a very long-term thing.
Yeah,
there is no magic bullet, silver bullet here.
It can take a dozen one-on-ones before you get your first good piece of information from someone.
Okay, and during those dozens of one-on-ones before, putting yourself out there, requesting for feedback, and sharing also on your end. I think we can take a couple of questions from the audience. So let me see. What can we try? How do you make sure you control your emotions when people provide feedback? How do you react, actually, to the feedback?
First, just realize whether the other person is right or wrong, you will probably have the same reaction. Because in effect, they're kind of attacking you. I mean, we don't like to say that, but they're kind of telling you something you're doing is wrong. And probably the root of that is something that's more than just something you can fix like that, right? It's probably a problem with the way you fundamentally interact with people at the root of it, realistically. So just first accept that your emotions are probably wrong. For the moment, right? It's fine. You can have your emotions. You feel how you feel, but the way you're going to be good at getting feedback and create value and create trust is if you give that person the benefit of the doubt that what they're saying is worth listening to, and worth being curious about. So, that's the main thing. It's if about controlling your emotions. Just assume your emotions are wrong and just. Kind of separate them from the situation.
Yeah, I can't agree more. It even happened to me last week, where, and the first impression, I guess, is the most important one. The frowning, the what, or this little 2 seconds where you're gonna actually react are the most important ones, and can just change the whole conversation.
Completely.
Where if you were just so I guess it's whether it's positive feedback, negative feedback, right or wrong, you just try to force yourself into being neutral and constructive, I guess, especially in those first seconds, because they're going to determine the rest, I guess.
That's an incredibly, incredibly good point. It reminded me, I haven't even thought about that consciously, but it reminded me of a engineering manager who, whenever I would give them feedback, their first reaction would be yeah, I get it. I wasn't really trying to do that. And then they would be okay, then we would talk about it, but already that dismissive, I wasn't trying to do that. It's well, but you did. So can we talk about it? Because you're probably going to do it again, and the next person may not be in a position that they can actually talk to you and give you the hard feedback. So totally, as soon as someone starts giving you feedback, just really force yourself to create a really warm environment, because then that's the next time. Let's say they give you some feedback and you're working on it, and you're curious if you got better at it or not. Are they going to be honest with you?
Yeah. A very other interesting question here, which I think many people have been through. So I always give candid and direct feedback to my manager, but I think this is negatively affecting our relationship. What would you suggest in this situation? So
Yeah, we were
someone
talking about this earlier. Giving feedback to someone who manages you is it's like level expert on the video game. Like it's really, I think it's the hardest thing because it's dependent on so many factors of you guys' relationship. That's what happens if the trust breaks down. So that's great. Continue to give candid, direct feedback, but keep in mind that like your personal relationship with them needs to continually be reinforced. So that balancing act is a skill set. Like just understand right now that's a skill set you're going to be working on for the rest of your life, and nobody is perfect at it. To balance that, like okay, like I wanna connect with you. I don't want to ruin this relationship, but I also want to give you some really hard feedback. That's super hard. So yeah, I mean, it depends on a lot of little things, little tactical things. Like again, in the book, Crucial Conversations, they go through stuff like that. But it's mostly about like continuing to, build some of the relationship, like build the personal capital, and then spend some of it, and then like give some hard feedback. But then go back and be like, after that hard conversation, be like, what do you think? What do you think of the feedback I'm giving? Do you think I'm off base? Do you think I'm just, off the reservation? Like, this is my perspective. What do you think? And really try and, again, this genuine curiosity thing, people pick up on it fast.
Like feedback on the feedback.
Right.
Feedbackception.
Yeah. That in and of itself is good. How do you think this feedback session went?
Yeah.
Is totally valid to ask and a really useful thing in and of itself. Because you might get back something that shocks you, right? They'll be like, well, I think you're a bozo who's wants my job or something. I don't know. Like you don't know like what's going to happen. And if you never get that, the way you're going to find out is through some channel that's going to be way less productive. It's going to be some rumor mill and it's going to be exaggerated. It's going to be way worse. So.
But what's super important here is that even if you're proactively trying to do something good and the other person is not reacting well, you're saying like keep the burden on yourself, like keep trying. You're somehow like the reason why this person is not accepting that feedback. This is the thing. Like put the burden on yourself. Always.
Yeah, and this point is a little bit controversial, I think, if you extend it too far. But I still really believe that like if you want to maximize your impact, just generally, to me, like it's always a useful exercise to say, what could I have done, to avoid a situation? Like, let's say you think someone has an unfair bias against you, right? We absolutely need to be working to correct those kind of things, but there's also this element of like that's just because of your work experience, right? They think you're too junior, right? That's something I think a lot of people pretty much everybody can relate to at some point, right? Let's say they think you're too junior. It's like, what can you do to kind of preempt that? What can you do to kind of say like, like what can you do in that situation to help that out and help make it where you're sharing that context? It's like you can start off the conversation with like, look, I know, I'm new to this. I'm just I don't have as much experience in this architecture as you do, something like that, right? But this is my idea. Like just something like that could help that conversation and help you get more feedback in the future and things like that.
I think we can go over like quickly one more, and it's interesting. It's like how do you make sure nice people give you honest feedback rather than just saying something nice? There are people they're always nice and they can hardly give feedback. So even if you keep asking, they will keep giving. But what's that feedback worth? How do you detect this and get the real feedback?
One way is to not interact with them directly, right? And it's to ask your manager or peer to ask them to like give a lot of assurances or things. That's a really good way. Beyond that, it's just continuing to try and build that personal relationship, because if they feel like your relationship is strong enough that it's not going to be taken as an offense, then that makes it even more likely they're going to say something, even if they are nice, too nice.
All right. Cool. Thanks a lot, Sam, for sharing this very like turning like your career around experience. And this is what Plato is all about. We have like a bunch of those stories. So let me just try to conclude on some like action items for you guys. So the first one is lead by example. Be proactive. Think about Sam's leader at Box. Force the people to give you feedback. The second one is let's put the burden on yourself. You'll always be more successful if you kind of take a step back and ask what you could be doing right. And then genuinely care and be perceived to be open to feedback. That's the most important thing. So thanks a lot, Sam. I hope you learned some stuff. It was super cool to chat with you. So I think right after this, we're having a break, and so Sam is going to be here and willing to take your question. There was a question about who is your executive coach, so I guess might not like do this in public, but I guess you can ask Sam in private. Yeah. Thank you very much.
Well, yeah. No, just to shout him out. His name's, I don't know if it'll blow up his inbox, but his name's Damien Faunen. I forget the group he works with, but if you look at Faunen, F-A-U-G-H-N-A-N, I think. Anyway, he's amazing, but there's a lot of really great people out there, and yeah, asking for referrals and recommendations is great.
Thank you.